All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're stepping right into our operational classroom to examine a really fascinating historical event, but we're going to look at it through a very specific structural lens. We're talking about the 1962 Sino-Indian War. But we're not just going to sit here and talk about high-level politics or simple troop movements. No, we're looking at this through the definitive lens of geographical asymmetry. Basically, we're focusing purely on the dirt, the rock, and the ice. As you'll see, we're going to explore how mountains, rivers, plateaus, and absolutely brutal weather didn't just host this conflict, they literally fought in it.
Okay, let's dive right into this core question. How exactly did geography shape these operations? Well, to answer that, we have to introduce the ultimate antagonist of this entire historical narrative, and that is the Himalayas. Spanning over 2,400 kilometers, this massive mountain range acts as this colossal physical barrier separating India, Tibet, and China. You know, when we study military history, we usually focus on the opposing armies, but here, the geography itself dictated everything. It told troops where they could walk, how they could be fed, and ultimately, who had the operational upper hand before a single shot was even fired.
And the sheer unbelievable scale of this region is just staggering. The Tibetan Plateau is rightfully known as the roof of the world. We're talking about a landmass measuring 1,000 by 2,500 kilometers. But the absolute critical number you need to remember here is the altitude. It averages over 14,800 feet above sea level. Having this immense elevated expanse essentially gave the Chinese forces massive strategic depth. It was like having a vast high-altitude staging ground sitting right on the border, completely upending the logistical realities of the entire region.
Now, a really crucial point here is understanding the actual surface of this plateau. Because, when you hear 14,000-foot elevation, you probably picture this impassable, snowed-in wasteland, right? But paradoxically, this desolate, frozen desert was an engineer's absolute dream. Because the surface is mostly barren, dry, and stony, it naturally facilitates road building. And even more importantly, it allows for sustained vehicle traffic with minimal maintenance. There's just very little precipitation compared to the regions further south, meaning these roads weren't constantly washing away. It was practically tailor-made for establishing robust, weather-resistant supply lines.
So this flat, dry terrain allowed the Chinese to build a massive strategic operational flow. Let's trace it out. Step 1 is Xinjiang in the northwest, a huge vital hub bordering multiple Central Asian countries and rich in fossil fuels. Step 3 is Tibet, which is that strategic front we just talked about. But the real linchpin here is Step 2, Aksai Chin. To connect that resource-heavy hub of Xinjiang down to the strategic front of Tibet, they needed a reliable link. And that link had to run straight through Aksai Chin, which is this incredibly arid, high-altitude desert sitting at a staggering average of 5,300 meters high.
That vital artery became a strict strategic necessity. Back in the 1950s, the Chinese constructed a motorable highway right across Aksai Chin, seamlessly linking Xinjiang to western Tibet. Because moving resources through this high-altitude desert was just infinitely easier than trying to navigate the treacherous, jagged mountain ranges further east. However, this road ran straight through territory fiercely claimed by India. Now look, our goal in this explainer absolutely isn't to take a political side on these border claims. We're just looking impartially at the reality on the ground. And the reality is, the construction of this specific, geographically necessary road was the primary friction point that sparked the whole conflict.
To really grasp the operations of 1962, we have to look at the entire chessboard. This immense 2,400-kilometer frontier basically breaks down into 3 distinct operational sectors. First up, you have the western sector, centered right around the rugged terrain of Ladakh. Next is the central sector, covering Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh. And finally, the eastern sector, historically known as the Northeast Frontier Agency, or NIFA, which maps to modern-day Arunachal Pradesh. And let me tell you, every single one of these sectors presented entirely different, absolute operational nightmares for the forces involved.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core asymmetry of the entire conflict. Just look at this infrastructure gap. On the Chinese side, operating on the Tibetan Plateau, you've got roads, motorized vehicles, and the total freedom of plateau mobility. Meanwhile, Indian forces, climbing up from the southern plains, were fighting against massive, brutal steep gradients. They were relying almost entirely on rudimentary mule tracks and foot porters. So you have an army capable of moving heavy supplies by truck, facing off against an army forced to literally carry everything on their backs, or on pack animals, up these grueling, near-vertical ascents. Let's dig a little deeper into the specific topographical hurdles the Indian forces were up against, because it wasn't just the steepness. The Indian approach was constantly battered by torrential monsoon rains. I mean, we're talking incessant landslides that would instantly wipe out any nascent road construction. On top of that, the river valleys, especially in the eastern sector, ran strictly north to south. That meant lateral movement. Basically, trying to move side to side along the front was virtually impossible. Troops had to hack their way through thick, impenetrable jungles at the base, only to then turn around and scale mountain passes soaring to 14,000 and sometimes even 17,000 feet.
Now, this brings us to a really fascinating geographical paradox, the air power anomaly. We just established that China had absolute dominance when it came to surface logistics, right? But because the Chinese airfields were located way up on the extremely high-altitude Tibetan Plateau, the incredibly thin air severely restricted the payload capacity of their bombers. They literally couldn't take off with full loads of fuel or armaments. Conversely, the Indian airfields were located at much lower altitudes down in the plains. This allowed their aircraft to fly with significantly higher payloads. It's just a fascinating example of how altitude gives with one hand and completely takes with the other.
Shifting our operational focus eastward for a moment, the coming frontier is where some of the absolute most critical and difficult operations took place. Just the act of moving troops and supplies from the Assam plains up into this jagged vertical landscape pushing toward the McMahon Line, honestly, it was an administrative and logistical trial by fire.
Navigating this eastern frontier meant forcing your way through some seriously terrifying strategic choke points. You had the Tawang Tract, the towering Selah Massif, the Bomdila Ridge, and the Thagla Ridge. The Indian forces had exactly one Class 5 fair-weather road, and it only reached part way to Tawang. And let me tell you, fair weather is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Under the heavy regional rains, this road rapidly dissolved into just pure mud and landslides. That meant that past a certain point, every single piece of ammunition, every ration of food, and every piece of clothing had to be moved forward purely by human foot over these massive ridges.
Actually, just listen to this note taken directly from the operational reports regarding the Namkachu River. It says, "Bridges, mere crossing places, constructed by felling logs across the Namkachu." That single sentence really strips away all the high-level, abstract military strategy and shows you the stark, freezing reality on the ground. When we talk about logistics and infrastructure in the sector, we aren't talking about concrete highways. We are quite literally talking about unacclimated soldiers trying to cross a freezing, roaring mountain river by desperately balancing on freshly felled, wet tree logs.
Which all boils down to this definitive, brutal operational equation: terrain plus logistics plus preparation equals outcome. The 1962 conflict was decided just as much by this simple math as it was by bullets. You had Indian troops, many of whom were unacclimatized and rushed straight up from the hot plains, braving temperatures well below -50 degrees Celsius at the end of a flooded, completely impassable mule track. They were quite literally fighting the mountain itself. The geography imposed absolute, rigid limitations on one side, while essentially offering a flat, dry, motorable highway to the other.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, somewhat provocative thought. We've clearly seen how the high-altitude deserts and the impassable river valleys of 1962 completely dictated the destiny of that conflict. The terrain literally became a weapon. So ask yourself, as technology continues to evolve, what invisible landscapes, whether they're in space, in the digital realm, or even deep under the oceans, will shape the operational logistics and conflicts of tomorrow? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the battlefield geography of 1962. Keep asking questions and always remember to look at the ground beneath the history.